You are listening to Stability Radio. This podcast is brought to you by the letter S for stability. It's like oxygen. Even fish like it. Today's guest is Dr. Seth Jones, author of several books, and is the expert in counterterrorism and counterinsurgency. Here is Scott Mann, CEO and founder of the Stability Institute.
Hey everybody, it's Scott Mann, founder and CEO of Stability Institute, where we broker knowledge and connect stability professionals on complex stability problems all over the world. And I want to welcome you and thank you for dialing in on one of our many podcasts that we're starting to generate on a range of topics related to stability issues, again, just all over the world. And today, we're very fortunate to have with us colleague, great friend, and also one of our advisors on the Stability Institute, Dr. Seth Jones. Seth is the Associate Director of International Security and Defense Policy Center. Did I get that right, Seth?
You did.
All right. And also, and more importantly to me, Dr. Jones has been an instrumental player in bottom-up stability initiatives in Afghanistan from the very beginning, really starting back in 2009. Dr. Jones brought forward an initiative to really change the game and how we stabilize rural Afghanistan with a bottom-up initiative known as the Community Defense Initiative. And he's also the author of two fantastic books on Afghanistan, In the Graveyard of Empire and also Hunting in the Shadows, which is about the larger hunt for al-Qaeda post 9/11. So, again, really fortunate to have Dr. Jones with us. He has been a critical player in the bottom-up stability game, and we've asked him to come here tonight to kind of render an azimuth check of sorts, a perspective on where we are as we go into the post-transition environment. So, Seth, thanks for joining us tonight.
Scott, thanks for having me. It's always a pleasure.
Well, listen, I know you recently returned from a trip to Afghanistan where you met with senior leadership, special operations forces, and I'm sure numerous Afghan counterparts. So I'm wondering if you would maybe take a minute or two to tell us what your major takeaways and impressions were at kind of a macro level coming back from that trip in terms of what transition means to America and the world in Afghanistan.
Yeah, that's a great question. I learned a couple of things from this most recent trip, and the time was spent talking to a number of senior NATO, U.S., and Afghan officials, as well as seeing some a range of forces out of the field. First, I just say broadly that the whole effort in Afghanistan is entering a period of probably the most serious risk that we've seen it in the last decade. The U.S. force presence is coming way down, and so much of the effort going forward then hinges on the ability of Afghan national security forces from the top down and Afghan local forces and local officials from the bottom up in establishing some modicum of stability, development, and governance, and then also dealing with a range of insurgent groups at the ground level. So the second big issue, though, is that, the performance is definitely mixed in some areas. In some provinces, in Kandahar that I visited, actually, which is really has been historically the center of gravity for the Taliban. They have not succeeded in a major way in controlling key terrain, including in their ability to push into Kandahar city. I mean, this was the heart of the inner Shura when they controlled the country. This is the area where they put pressure on during Operation Medusa in the 2005-2006 period, and they have simply not been able to get the stranglehold that they have wanted, thanks in part to both top-down and bottom-up efforts in multiple districts. In other places in the east, in Paktika, and Khos, the Haqqanis have pushed into additional territory as U.S. and other NATO forces have drawn down, and in some areas of Helmand province, just to use another example, there's been a push of some insurgent forces into areas. So there is there is great risk that we're entering. That's not meant to be a negative issue. It's just that a lot will now depend not on what U.S. or other NATO forces are doing, because they're increasingly moving into a supporting role, and much will depend on the ability of the Afghans at multiple levels to fight, develop, and govern.
Okay. Well, first of all, I appreciate that rundown, because I think it's important to get that kind of honest perspective as we look at what lies ahead for us as we continue to work in Afghanistan. But I want to back the clock up a little bit here, Seth. A lot of the guys and gals that are going into Afghanistan now, maybe were not familiar with the emergence of village stability operations and Afghan local police, and you talk about bottom up. I wonder if you could just talk a little bit about, you were the influential architect and driver behind village stability operations, and a lot of guys had a role in that, but you really were a key architect in that. So I wonder if you could tell us, when it was village defense or community defense initiative, how did that evolve in your mind and those early pioneers of it as a concept that turned into reality? What were the major tenets that you were looking at that made this such a compelling approach in Afghanistan?
Well, Scott, let me just start off by saying that, for several years, the U.S. and other NATO countries, actually the Afghans themselves, had been operating predominantly from the top down, meaning that the focus was on building national security forces and pushing development and governments entirely from or predominantly through formal central government mechanisms. And when you got out into rural areas, little bit was being done, certainly coordinated and across the board, working with tribal, sub-tribe, clan actors and other, the broader informal structure, and then other actors that were quite influential in local areas. And so the challenge when you look historically at Afghanistan is that the eras of stability between, say, 1929 and 1979, around the time that the Soviets invade, that period of stability, almost 50 years, was done with a combination of both central government efforts from the capital and working, co-opting local officials at the village and the sub-village level. So this really was a team effort. This was not me. This was a team effort, particularly from the SOF community across multiple J codes, and really with the strategic guidance of General Ed Reeder to implement a program initially called the Community Defense Initiative, and then that migrated names to Village Stability Operations, with a security component being Afghan local police, whose real focus was to recognize the informal dimension of security and governance and development in Afghanistan. That as we got into rural areas, a lot of Afghan villagers just needed help in informal dispute resolution. They needed help in basic agricultural assistance at the village level, and they needed basic help in providing self-defense at the village level. And they had historical institutions to do this. It wasn't just about national institutions coming from Kabul. So the whole focus of this shift in U.S. military and development efforts that began around 2009 was to add a part of the war and the struggle that just didn't exist. I mean, the focus again had been predominantly on working by, with, and through the central government, and that was necessary, but it was simply not sufficient in controlling areas, especially in rural parts of the country. So that's the sort of heart that begins to happen in 2009, and the transition that led to the creation of VSO and ALP.
Awesome. So you're talking about the 2009 period. A lot's happened since then, Seth, and as you look across, Afghan transition today, village stability operations is really not the part, of that picture that it once was. And so, kind of targeting this question for the benefit of senior leaders, strategists, and policymakers, based on your experience both at a macro and micro level, what do you think the future holds for Afghan local police as a program in Afghanistan and stability in general in Afghanistan if we're not able to do a meaningful bottom-up approach for the long haul?
Well, Scott, that is the $64,000 question. I mean, that is one of the most important questions I think that U.S., Afghan, and other NATO officials need to grapple with honestly. I think that the Afghan local police program and efforts to work with sub-state actors will be very important moving forward in Afghanistan, including after the December 2014 full transition to Afghan lead, where the U.S. combat role will be significantly reduced, if not reduced entirely. But there are risks in doing it without the village stability operations component, and that is including not just security aspects, building a security force, but working on governance and economic development at the village level. Without that broader concept, it does become, and it risks becoming, a heavily security-focused enterprise. That's not to say that you can't secure key territory, you can't weaken the Taliban or other insurgent groups operating in a given area, but it just means that the response becomes more heavily security-focused than it has before. The second issue is that without a lot of special operations and in a few cases conventional forces in the field, the success really then hinges on local entities, so ALP in a particular area, their connections with Afghan National Security Forces, including with the Afghan National Army Special Forces, with the commandos. So what I think you'll probably see is a lot more variation in the quality of local police. Some areas, they'll be quite good. They'll be well integrated into their villages. They'll be well integrated with local national police, ANP, and Afghan National Army forces. In some areas, they won't be as closely connected. And then in still other areas, there may be programs that are done. This is one area that I would note some caution, done for political reasons. The Afghan government may try to encourage the creation of local police for largely political reasons, that there's not necessarily support within a community for having local guards, other than that they get paid. So the motivation may tend to be largely money, and it may be used for political purposes. So there are risks involved in jettisoning most of the VSO aspect and focusing on the security component. But again, that's the reality of the situation in Afghanistan. The U.S. footprint is coming down, but that's just what has to be dealt with.
Okay, last question. Before Afghanistan even really wraps up, Seth, we're seeing emerging threats popping up all over the world, from Syria to Libya to Somalia and other places, other hotspots. How important to you, in your opinion, is the bottom-up approach for these areas beyond Afghanistan and the associated lessons that we learn from this approach in dealing with these strategic undergoverned areas that are popping up all over the globe?
Well, Scott, I think as the Afghan case shows, many local communities want to be able to stand up for themselves. They want to be able to protect themselves. They want to be able to feed their families, and they want to be able to govern, take care of problems at the local level. So, in particular, we see that in countries where the state, the central government apparatus, is limited in scope. And so we see in a range of places, either because of socio-cultural reasons, that is, the existence of tribes, sub-tribes, or clans, or geography, islands. This is what you get in Indonesia and the Philippines. Or because of warfare has weakened the security apparatus, that you get a very important need to establish a bottom-up approach to complement building the state. So examples would include, especially states with limited central government role, many of the places we're seeing Al-Qaeda and other Salafi jihadist movements, including in Libya, in Mali, in Somalia, in Yemen, obviously in Afghanistan and Pakistan. Those are examples, as well as moving into the Pacific in places like Indonesia and the Philippines. These are countries where the state apparatus is limited, and that if you focus only on security development and governance in trying to defeat insurgent and terrorist organizations, you're going to miss a very important part of the fabric, and that is local elements, whether they're tribes or sub-tribes or clans or other communities that the state does not touch at the moment. So I think, Scott, to answer your question, that emerging threats are popping up all over the world. And it is very important that a bottom-up approach and the associated lessons learned in dealing with these ungoverned or undergoverned areas, as we've seen in places like Afghanistan, that we look at adapting to each of these countries some of the lessons we've learned in establishing bottom-up approaches. I think it's very important, and I think you don't do this the same in every location. Even where it's been applied in places like Iraq to some degree, but Afghanistan more recently, it's applied differently in different areas. So when we're talking about migrating this sort of concept to other countries, of course it gets done differently. A lot depends on local conditions. But the approach, I think, is very important in recognizing these are not states with a strong central apparatus, and we have to recognize that and deal with them accordingly.
Well, Dr. Jones, as always, it's a pleasure talking with you, both as a friend and a colleague, and like I said, someone who's really done just yeoman's work to make our community, our leaders, aware of the importance of traditional, informal civil society and the role that local communities play in these tough places. And we're honored to have you on the Institute as an advisor, and we really appreciate all that you've done for this program and for helping promote stability around the world. So we really appreciate you joining us tonight.
Well, thank you, Scott. Thanks for all the work that the Stability Institute does. It's reaching out and touching and informing and discussing really important issues. I cannot overstate how important your mission and your daily tasks are.
Well, I appreciate that. And for those of you listening to the podcast, we encourage you to tell us what you think. Dr. Jones and myself and all of our leadership here at the Institute are very keen to hear what you think about the podcast. So feel free to post a comment as well as share and like this broadcast with your friends on Facebook. Also ask you to do the same on LinkedIn. And if you haven't joined the Stability Institute as a member, just go to the New Members tab, fill out the short application there, and we'd love to have you on board. So thanks again to everybody for listening. This is Scott Mann, Director and Founder of the Stability Institute, and we'll see you next time on our next podcast or on Stability Television. Thanks for what you do out there, and have a great evening.